Here's the name of the presentation, and I'd like to get right into it. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois. I was born in 1958, and I first rode passenger trains at the very tail end of when they were operated by private railroads. This was before Amtrak. And when I was a teenager, I very much enjoyed riding these trains. There's me with my friend Stuart Ferguson about to go out to Colorado, and on the right you can see me illegally leaning out of a Peoria rocket because I wanted to see the view better. I enjoyed those early rides. I've been enthusiastic about passenger trains since. I've also hopped freight trains. And I'm not saying this is a good idea, but these pictures were taken actually from the top of a hopper car that we climbed up while the train was going. Not a great idea, but they're pretty good pictures. This isn't a good idea either. If you're going to sit on a boxcar, stay inside, but I wanted to see the view, so there you go. And here are me and a few other friends in a boxcar somewhere between Albert Lea and Owatonna, Minnesota on the old Rock Island. I also worked legitimately on freight trains for a short time on the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad in central Illinois. No pictures of that. And I was also a coach and sleeping car porter for Amtrak for a time. Like many other people, I enjoy watching trains go by. And this, of course, is the North Shore Scenic Railroad next to the Lake Walk. And I've been able to go all over the country and all over the world, well, not everywhere, and enjoy rides on trains. This is in California on Amtrak, and it's been fun. I've enjoyed riding fast trains. I've enjoyed riding slow trains. I've even enjoyed riding a train that looks like a dog. And I care about public transit. I was on the DTA board with Mike Casey back there, and I was on it for well over a decade. But, as Dave made clear, I am not a historian. I am not an expert about the rail history of the Twin Ports. I am a generalist with a long-time interest in public transit and railroads, and maybe that's a weakness, maybe it's a strength, maybe it's something in between, but that's what you've got. So, this is, I think, one of two traditional PowerPoint slides you'll see. This is what my talk is about, why railroads were needed, the freight trains that helped grow the Twin Ports, passenger trains that helped bring people to and from the Twin Ports, streetcars and inclines that helped get people around the Twin Ports and how they shaped Duluth, and then some short thoughts about today and tomorrow. And I talk about the Twin Ports. Most of this material is about Duluth, but there's also a very rich history of Superior, and so we'll talk about that a little bit too. All right. So, about the sources for my information. Some of it is stuff that I've just known for years, and I'm not sure exactly where I got it. But that's not all of it. This is a book called Twin Ports Trains by Tony Durkins and Jeff Lemke. It's really good. There's 10 of them out there. There's Hadrian. They're $50 each. That's the list price, and a big portion of that will go to the Folk School if you buy it. Okay? What's interesting about this book to me is that unlike a lot of railroad books, this book talks about not just that the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic was organized in 1889, but the bigger context. And there's all sorts of little sidebars about all sorts of little interesting things. So I urge you to take a look at it. I found it fascinating, and I learned a lot of things. This is a second book that I used a lot, Twin Ports by Trolley. Here it is. You can take a look at my copy if you want. This is from the University of Minnesota Press. Unfortunately, I think it's out of print, but you can still find copies around. It's well worth looking at. And finally, I got a lot of information from the University of Minnesota Duluth Library that has a marvelous collection of old streetcar pictures and railroad pictures. Our neighbor Pat Moss let me in there one day many years ago, and I took some photocopies of them, and you'll see some of those. Okay, so let's talk about why Duluth why Duluth needed rails. I'm going to talk first rather generally about the need for railroads. This slide to us today is kind of quaint. Look at that, isn't that cute? Look at that old, fancy-looking, cute little railroad train. And it looks like something that's kind of far back, and it is, and not very consequential. I don't think those of us here and now can really understand the amazing effect of the railroads throughout the world. So, in the middle of the 19th century, this was a time of slow travel by boat, if you could have that, or by horse, or by walking along bad roads or bad trails, and that was about it. And then, railroads, in contrast, could transport people and goods farther, faster, and cheaper in all kinds of weather. Why is that the case? And that's because steel wheel on steel rail is extraordinarily efficient. Even today, with far better tires than there were in 1850, and far better roads than there were in 1850, it takes about 4 times the energy to move a ton of freight on the road than on the railroad. And that disparity was probably a lot more in 1850, 1860, 1870, and so on. So this was a revolutionary technology. And throughout much of the world, railroad expansion accelerated in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And this was true in Minnesota generally. It was true in Duluth. So I'm going to show you a series of pictures. I'm not going to linger on them. These are maps from a book that has 1870. And the railroads are these various colored lines, and it's pretty sparse. Everything's on the Twin Cities, and there's that one blue line that goes up towards the Twin Ports. 1870, check this out. 1880, a lot more. 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, and even through 1960, although there was some consolidation, it's still a very intense net. So, that's the broad idea. Railroads were particularly important to Duluth's development. And so this is one of the marvelous maps from Twin Ports trains. Duluth and Superior share a wonderful harbor, but after the copper boom and bust of the 1850s, Duluth was dying. For this harbor to reach any kind of potential, timber and ore and grain from the interior had to be transported to that harbor. And railroads were the only answer at scale. That was the only way to do it. This is before the railroad came. This is the Twin Ports in 1869. And not a lot of people here. By 1865, 126 people, according to the census. Not too many, because Duluth had busted. And then, in 1870, people realized that Duluth was a natural railroad destination, even though it wasn't a city. But the question was, how do you get to the Duluth Harbor? How do you get to the Twin Ports Harbor from Chicago or Milwaukee or St. Paul or Minneapolis, all of which were real cities then and were becoming real rail centers? And there were significant engineering challenges because of the escarpment that we all know about here in Duluth. Not easy to do. So a railroad called the Lake Superior and Mississippi, isn't that a wonderful font? They really did it really well then. It was building in the 1860s from St. Paul toward the heads of the lakes. And Jay Gould, who you may have heard of, he largely financed the completion of that railroad, as well as the Northern Pacific Railroad that went all the way out to Puget Sound. And it was Jay Gould who decided that Duluth would be the terminal of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad. And this was really important because Duluth got its railroad and got connected to the entire network in 1870, and thereby was connected to the Northern Pacific, and you could go anywhere. Duluth's fortunes went up, while Superior had to wait over a decade for a second railroad to come to it. There's the Lake Superior in Mississippi again. You can see the route. And that's the Northern Pacific that went all the way west that the Lake Superior in Mississippi connected with in Carlton. Now the route as the first railroad into Duluth, Northern Pacific was the dominant one. They were able to pick the best route, and they grabbed the best land. And so that was the typical pattern with railroads and probably a lot of other things. So you can recognize this. This is where the freeway now goes through in downtown Duluth, is where the yards were. This is Rice's Point. And just as before, there is that big viaduct over the railroad tracks. Look at that huge roundhouse, and then all the industry down there. And the Northern Pacific Railroad was one of the most important railroads in the western United States and built a number of lines, not only down to St. Paul, Minneapolis, but west to Staples and up to get the iron ore. So it was a substantial railroad. And even though I didn't know that you were going to be here, Dave, but I had a plug in here, this beautiful picture of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad train. It's well worth going on that ride. Now, the original route of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad goes from downtown and along the waterfront, this route that Dave was talking about, to Boy Scout Landing, west to Fond du Lac, and then, surprisingly, up the St. Louis River. And we all know that's a really tough route. That's a very difficult route. And before long, they had to find a better route because it was too difficult. And that became what was known as the Duluth Short Line. And the Duluth Short Line was eventually abandoned for another line, and that's the Munger Trail. So between Thompson and West Duluth, you're going on also another one of the first railroads coming into Duluth. So this is 1885, and other railroads did start to come into Duluth, most notably the Great Northern. I'm not having any luck with this. Let's see. There we go. Coming in here through the swampland. But there isn't a whole lot of railroads. There's a few coming in, but the Lake Superior and Mississippi Northern Pacific is really by itself in Duluth, pretty much. There's a bridge over the estuary there, and that's about it. Look at what's happened to the population, folks. 1870s, just talking about Duluth, 3,000 people. 1885, 18,000 people. And now we have 1900, and you can see a lot more routes coming in. This is the Mesabian Iron Range, all sorts of railroad coming from all sorts of directions. And by 1890, Duluth has 35,000 people. 1900, 52,000 people. By 1920, this is a fairly mature map of the Duluth Superior rails. You have 78,000 people in 1910, 98,000 in 1920, and you had over 100,000 people in 1930. And at that point, as we all know, the population of Duluth kind of stagnated for a long time. But during its heyday, while things were being built, the railroad was a huge part of the whole view that the person would see when they came into town. It was not an afterthought. It was an extremely important thing. There were other railroads that came in, as I mentioned, the Great Northern Railway. How many people have heard of James J. Hill? A lot of people. Okay. So, you know, he was known as the Empire Builder. You might not like that moniker, but he was who built the Great Northern, and he was different than a lot of the robber baron railroad people because he built to last and very carefully and built good lines. And so, interestingly enough, a lot of those lines still exist, these Great Northern lines. And the Great Northern basically knew they couldn't really dominate Duluth, so they dominated Superior. And this here is the Great Northern Bridge. Let's see if I can get that. And what's interesting here is you not only have a railroad bridge with a swing span, but you also had, at one time, trolley tracks, and then you have general traffic. So this was a bridge that connected to Duluth at the end of Rice's Point. If you drive on Garfield all the way to the end, you will find what looks to be a fishing pier, and it's the remains of that old bridge. It's called the Interstate Bridge. Thank you. Good point. Okay, when you go out Garfield Avenue and you go from Superior Street to Garfield and then get on the Blotnick Bridge, that's Rice's Point. Thank you. Appreciate that. There's also the Sioux Line Railway, which was an amalgamation of different railways, and they went to all sorts of places out west, southwest. They had a line that went into the cities. This is all around 1910. All these had been built. But railroads also didn't just come to Duluth. Railroads came out of Duluth. They were built. They were more homegrown. One of them was the Duluth and Iron Range. And that went up to Two Harbors and then up to the range. And then there was the Duluth, Mesabi, and Northern. Went this way, getting all the iron ore. There was basically a conveyor belt to bring all the iron ore to the ore docks so then the ore could be processed either in Duluth or elsewhere. It's now known as the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range Railroad, or the Mesabi Road. Amazing steam engines carrying these heavy loads down the hill. I'm sure many of you have been to the depot and seen some of those remarkable articulated locomotives, which mean they bend. It's just amazing. And the ore docks. Believe it or not, these four, from what I read, are wood. They're building this enormous structure 2,000 feet out into the harbor, made out of wood. They're not around anymore. And they built them out of steel. So this was ore docks 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 and 6, and I think 7. And I believe it's only number 5 that's operational now. You, of course, can see the ore docks when you're going on I-35 west of downtown, and they pass over you. So, freight trains brought raw materials to Duluth and to Superior. Some was shipped out, some was processed here, some at the steel mill. Because of the railroads, the shipping industry boomed, as well as local manufacturing. And so the railroads were the engine that made Duluth a wealthy and important city. And there were other railroads that I don't have maps for. The Omaha Road that became part of the Chicago Northwestern that basically followed US 53 down to Eau Claire. And then there was one, I love this name, the Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic. Now that's a grand name. I mean, why be the Duluth and St. Paul? Be the Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic. And it actually made it as far as Sault Ste. Marie, where there were connections to the East Coast on the Canadian railroads. And there was also Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific. I mean, Duluth and Winnipeg, that's what it originally was. But Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific sounds much better. And that still exists. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's an extremely important bridge route that carries very heavy traffic today. All right, so that's about freight trains and freight railroads. And freight traffic was what was most important to most railroads. But I'm going to pivot to passenger trains. In a time when there were very few good alternatives to the railway, passenger traffic was important, it was significant. There were probably around 1910, 1915, probably at least 50 trains coming in and out of Duluth Union Depot, the depot, every day, and that doesn't count the ones that came into the other depots because there was more than one depot in Duluth. So this is the railroad net as it was in 1910. And from Duluth, you could go anywhere in the country and to Canada. By 1910, the Great Northern, the Sioux Line, the Northern Pacific, and the Omaha Road all offered service to the Twin Cities, with many departures each day, all day. Think about that. From the Twin Cities, once you were there, you could go virtually anywhere in the country. You could go south to Texas if you wanted to. You could go to St. Louis. You could go to Milwaukee, Kansas City, Omaha, and to the West Coast. This line here to Staples, where is that? Yeah, this one to Staples That was run by the Northern Pacific. Who wants to go to Staples? Well, actually, if you're in Staples, you can catch all of the Northern Pacific trains that go out west to the Dakotas, to Montana, to Puget Sound, to Portland, to California, and so on. So it was an important connection for Duluth. Didn't have to go down to the cities to go west. You could cut it off in Staples. And then the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic offered service east to the Sault Ste. Marie, and from there into eastern Canada. Even roads that were made just really to carry freight, the DM and IR, carrying the iron ore, that's what they were about. But they still offered passenger trains up from Duluth to the range and as far up as Ely. So there were direct trains to Chicago on 2 different railroads, the Omaha Road and the Soo Line. So you could go anywhere you wanted in the United States that had a train depot. It was really a remarkable time. And to serve the passenger traffic, there was, of course, the Union Depot that we all know, 5th Avenue West and Michigan Street. And there were a lot of other ones. There were ones, the Indian Station, people know about that. That used to be farther east than it is now. It was actually moved to its current location at the very head of the lake. There were 2 different passenger trains stations in West Duluth. There were a number of them in Superior. But I want to talk about this one. This one that's not here right now. This is the Soo Line Depot. And the Soo Line was a relative latecomer to Duluth. But it wanted its own passenger depot in downtown Duluth located on Superior Street. So it built this one on the lower side of Superior Street between 6th Avenue West and 8th Avenue West. So kind of catty corner from the depot that we all know, and it's where Gateway Towers now is. You understand where it's kind of across from the incline. Anyway, the problem for the Soo Line is that this location on Superior Street was an excellent location for a passenger depot, but it wasn't easy to get there because Northern Pacific and Great Northern were there first, and they had all the routes into downtown already locked up, and they weren't going to open it up just for a friendly competitor. So what did the Soo Line do? They had to tunnel under Superior Street from 8th Avenue West to 12th Avenue West. And this was through bad rock, and they had to keep Superior Street propped up. It was apparently a lot tougher than they thought it was. There's the train coming out on the other end, kind of near where M&H is. It cost $2.5 million to do this in 1909, equivalent to about $85 million today. And that does not include the cost of that, which doesn't look very cheap, and if you've seen pictures of it, inside, there's marble and so on. Why am I mentioning this? Because this, I think, shows better than many things the optimism that people had about what Duluth was and what it could be. You don't build a depot and spend this kind of money if you think Duluth is going to be a backwater. And so the Soo Line, which was not a major player, wanted in on the action and spent an astonishing sum to carry passengers to and from Duluth. I also learned, while preparing for this, that when in the 1960s, when passenger traffic was declining in Duluth and throughout the country, that there was a move to convert a depot into the St. Louis County Cultural and Heritage Arts, whatever it's called. This was actually the depot that was selected. It was supposed to be this one. But what happened is that there had been years of neglect, and apparently there were some structural problems. And so what ended up happening is that this depot got torn down instead of Union Depot, which was supposed to be torn down, and the St. Louis County Heritage Center is in the old Union Depot. I didn't know that. I thought it was interesting. So, there was an important spike in traffic during World War II, but I want to step back a little bit and talk about what passenger trains did in this country after the peak of 1910, 1915, 1920. Does this sound all right? Okay. So, about 1920, depends on where you were in the country, that was about the peak of the passenger traffic and railroad passenger trains in this country in terms of the amount of people riding it and the number of trains. And I did mention a spike during World War II, but generally from 1920 on, there was a fairly long level decline, except for that spike during World War II. Why? It's pretty obvious. What happened is that the roads got better. Now, how did that happen? That happened because of public funding, partially through gas taxes, but also through general revenues, and also through the property tax. And so what the railroads were doing, which were for-profit organizations who were having to pay taxes on their own rights of way, they were put at a competitive disadvantage, especially as cars became cheaper and better. And then the Great Depression hit the railroads hard. They had huge fixed costs, but decreased traffic. And so the railroads net began to contract and passenger trains started disappearing. After World War II, the railroads attempted to come back. There was a lot of optimism, and so they invested in new track, new rolling stock, and you had air-conditioned cars. Some of the trains were the fastest they'd ever been. They were the best they'd ever been. But basically, even though railroads, even like the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, which was not really a passenger carrier, invested in new cars, it didn't really work. Some went down more than others, and you saw the local trains go first, and then the medium trains that were stopping at maybe more places. And so fewer and fewer trains were operating for passengers. You had the interstate highway system that really took away the ability of the trains to be faster than cars. There you go. And of course, there were the airlines. And that is heavily subsidized as well through an air traffic control system that is not fully paid for by ticket taxes or any other way. It comes out of general revenues. Even so, in 1962, you could still go to a lot of places if you were in Duluth. There were 2 trains a day to Staples, both connecting to trains out to the West Coast. Think about that. You had 3 trains a day on the Great Northern Pacific to the Twin Cities. You had an overnight train to Chicago on the Soo Line. And just a little bit before, there had been trains up to the Iron Range, but those were discontinued by then. And if you were in the Twin Cities, even then, if you look at the density of this map, with the thicker line showing the frequency of service, there were still a lot of places you could go from the Twin Cities, which are right here. And you could go to Chicago, and you go all over the place. I'm using this because I have to. I don't like this as much, but it works. So this is 1962. 1967, just before the United States Postal Service pulled the mail contracts from the trains. And when the Postal Service made that decision, that was really the end of the line for a lot of passenger trains because mail contracts had basically kept them afloat. So look at this, 1967, 1970. Right? That affected Duluth. The train to Staples disappeared. There was less frequency. And by the time 1971 came around, there were only 2 trains a day out of Duluth, both to the Twin Cities. And then when Amtrak came, look at how skeletal that system is compared to what we saw even 10 years earlier. 1962, 1971. And service to Duluth disappeared. However, people wanted that, particularly Representative Willard Munger, who was a champion of the passenger train to Duluth. And so a train called the Arrowhead was reinstated in 1975 with a single round trip down to the cities and was state supported. And then that train was extended to Chicago, and it was an overnight schedule. It was called the North Star. I happened to work that when I was on Amtrak. One time, I worked the North Star as a porter or car attendant. But in 1985, the funding ran out for the North Star, and it was discontinued. And what has it been? It's been 40 years since then, and we have not had regular rail passenger service to Duluth. This decline is not the result of obsolete technology being superseded by a better technology. The decline was not due to simple market forces. The decline was the result of governmental policies that made huge public investments into highways and airways and waterways while taxing railroads. So we'll talk a little bit later about maybe whether we'll see passenger trains come back, but I leave you with that. This is one of my favorite pictures that I have, any historical picture either. I don't know if you and Beck can see what's going on here, but this is a Duluth streetcar, and this boy is beaming. He is so happy to be next to this wonderful conveyance and next to the conductor of the streetcar. It's a wonderful picture. I think this might have been taken up at the top of Woodland. And so, the next part of this presentation is about streetcars and inclines. And the railroads put Duluth on the map. The passenger trains got people to Duluth and from Duluth, but streetcars and the inclines, that's inclines plural, moved people around Duluth and the Twin Ports. Again, why would you have streetcars in the first place? Is it because they're cute? No, they were a technological advance. Because just as in the open country, streets in cities were terrible. Have any of you read reference to the mud in cities in the 1870s, 1860s, 1880s, 1890s? They're not talking about mud. They're talking about manure and urine and mud and water, all in this nasty slurry. Okay? If you build essentially a railroad on top of the street, so that you have the advantage of the steel wheel over the steel rail, you have a comfortable ride and you don't have to be walking through that stuff. So, to begin with, there were horse cars. They were like these, except they were pulled by a horse. And they were cheap to put together, but they were pretty slow. Horse can't go that far, and a horse cannot pull many people, and it can't pull them up the hill. So, there were innovations. Some streetcar companies put steam engines, little tiny steam engines, at the front of the streetcars. That didn't go over well because there weren't spark arresters, and this just created all sorts of pollution. Then people came up with cable cars. And we think about cable cars in the context of San Francisco. They actually existed in Chicago. They existed in St. Paul. They existed in a number of cities around the country as a solution to something that wasn't as bad as the horse car. And then a man named Frank Sprague invented the electric streetcar. And it was an immediate hit. Now think about this. He demonstrated its efficacy in 1887, I think in Richmond, Virginia. By the early 1890s, virtually all major systems had converted to electricity in about 5 years. It's just an astonishing changeover. And here you can see it is a big deal. This is in South Superior, and this is the first day of the electric streetcars, and it is a big deal. So a streetcar boom followed in the United States, and this was true in Duluth and Superior as well. The main operator of streetcars in Duluth was the Duluth Street Railway Company, though there were some other independents that eventually got swallowed up. There was one that was just on Park Point. There was one that went up to Woodland. There was one that went out to Lakeside. There were independent ones out in Superior, but eventually they all got under the umbrella of the Duluth Street Railway Company. How many of you have noticed this building at the corner of Superior Street and 27th Avenue West? Okay, I want you to notice something here. Check this out. That's the headquarters of the Duluth Street Railway Company, still there. And the construction shows you that this was a serious operation. They meant it to last. So, street railways were a for-profit venture. and were subject to the terms of a franchise granted by the city. So this was good for the street railway company in some ways. They were essentially able to have a monopoly in the areas where they ran. There was going to be no other competitors, no other streetcars, if they had the charter or the franchise to do that. And that gave them an effective monopoly. However, in return, the city would set the fares, which remained way too long at a nickel because it was a political deal, and the city would not allow the fare to raise even though costs had gone up, and would require the company to plow the streets where they ran, and would mandate that the company extend lines to areas often ahead of development, such as to Kenwood and to Chester Park. Has anybody here heard the term transit-oriented development? Is that kind of a transit nerd kind of thing? Yeah, okay, a few people. This was transit-oriented development over a century ago. And this picture is not a beautiful picture, but it's interesting. This is Winona Street and Woodland in 1914. Look at the condition of that street. Is that where you want to drive? Probably not. Here it is right now. And real estate speculators bought land and often were the people involved in creating the streetcar or street railways. This is up in Duluth Heights. You can see Central Entrance, Orange Street, which is where a streetcar line ran. And what's the name of this plat or this division? The legal name is Car Line Gardens. That's a direct reference to the streetcars that originally brought people up there to Duluth. So I want to go back to this one. Basically, what these transit-oriented development, or whatever you want to call it, helped settle a large part of the city. And these were what were called streetcar suburbs. Lakeside, Duluth Heights, Woodland, and Kenwood, to a certain extent, were streetcar suburbs because building and housing and businesses followed the streetcar lines. Okay, does anybody recognize this spot? This is Wallace Avenue at Bruce Street, just north of St. Marie, looking north, right? So I want you to pay attention. This one, see these two houses there? You can't even see them. There's all these houses in between. So this was, they're about up here. And all of this that was empty fields became settled with houses around 1910, 1920, and so on. I really like this picture. This is looking from Arrowhead and Wallace, looking down towards downtown, downhill. And again, take a look at these two houses with the rather distinctive roof line. There they are. This was because of the streetcars. That's why those houses are there. And the system was really quite extensive. This is a 1911 map. And the reason I'm using it is because it's the best one I was able to find. I really like it. Notice all the cartoon ships coming in. It's fun. And so you can see that there is a streetcar line that went all the way out to Leicester Park. There was ones on 4th Street, on Superior Street. There was a line that went up to Woodland Avenue via Wallace. This was the main lines on Grand Avenue. There was a streetcar down Park Point. And then there was one that went over to Superior on the Interstate Bridge. Pretty interesting. It was really an extensive system. This one bears special mention. This is the Duluth Heights streetcar. But to get to that, you had to take the incline. In the 20s, even as late as 1923, the streetcar system was still being expanded. This is a view that's near and dear to me because it's right by my house, about 3 blocks away. This is East 8th Street, looking towards, what's the name of that restaurant? Sarah's Table. Looking towards that direction at Kent Road. That's it. This is where the trolley turned around. And today, funny enough, it's still a vacant lot. This strange pie-shaped lot. Still there. Kent Road, West Kent, and 8th Street. Here is 17th Avenue East and 8th Street, again around 1923. Take a look. These are the ties that are being put down. They're building it. Here it is now. This house is that house. One of the things that's striking about these old pictures, do you find it striking the absence of trees? It's really. I'm going to return to this picture. This is Terran's Market, or what later was known as Terran's Market, which is now Sarah's Table at 19th Avenue East and 8th Street. And here they are putting in the streetcar rails again. This is around 1923. And that's it now. Now, Duluth Heights and a place called Bayview Heights were special cases. The grades up the hill to those places were so steep that you either had to have a very circuitous route if you wanted to get up there, or you needed a different system altogether. And the different system was the Duluth inclines. And it's basically a cable-operated system. You're seeing this dog descending the hill, but basically they're on a cable and they counterweight each other. So as one goes up, the other goes down. And that way you can reduce the amount of power you need to bring those things back up on a hill because the counterweights help do that. So the system that is used in Ikema in Japan was used in Duluth. Oh, this is one that, it doesn't have to be a dog, it can be a cake. This is one of these amazing pictures. This is before 1901. The Duluth Incline, which started around Incline Station at 7th Avenue West and Superior Street and went straight up the hill, used these enormous cars. These were cars that were large enough to haul a horse and a wagon up. This was not small-time stuff. You can get a sense of the scale, and then they built a pavilion so people could dance and have a good time at the top of the hill. This is above skyline, right? But all good things must come to an end. Apparently, this caught fire in 1901 one day, and then the fire spread to the cable house, and then the fire was hot enough that it burned through the cable or caused the cable to melt, and then you had one of these things rocketing down the hill in flames to the bottom of the hill. Luckily, people could see what was going to happen, and nobody was hurt, although you can see there was quite a bit of damage. And they rebuilt it. And this is what the more famous incline looked like. You had these two cars going like this every 15 minutes, and then at the top of the hill, there's a streetcar that went up to Duluth Heights. I like this picture. This kind of gives you a sense of the scale of the incline. Again, notice the lack of trees. And this is in the last year of its operation. It says, incline soon to be eliminated under Duluth's Transit Modernization Plan. We'll talk a little bit about that. This was 1939. There was a second incline. It was called the Duluth Beltline. It started at 61st Avenue West, and it went straight up the hill to a development called Bayview Heights that was not quite as successful. And it didn't have service every 15 minutes. It wasn't operating from an area with dense population. Some of the headways were like every 2 hours, every hour. And, well, folks, it just wasn't much of a success. It did manage to stumble on for about 17 years and was dismantled in 1916 or 1917. But while it was running, it was a source of pride, and it was there, and it helped some people get to and from work, and it settled a little bit of the area above Skyline Drive, west in Bayview Heights. So, getting back to the streetcars. The company ran very frequent service on many lines, and ridership continued to climb. 10.9 million in 1901. The peak, 45.2 million rides in Duluth and Superior on the Duluth Street Railway in 1919. But this is before the Depression. It's almost halved, 23 million rides. In 10 years, almost a 50% drop, and by the depths of the Depression in 1933-34, down to 13.3 million rides. That's less than a third of what it had been 15 years earlier. So the question is, what happened? Why did this happen? And what happened is that many of the streets had been paved at public expense, and again, cars got better, and people started driving. And some people, even they were called jitneys, in private motor cars, knew where the streetcar lines were, and they'd drive ahead of the streetcar and scoop up riders and charge just a little bit less than the streetcar did. And the streetcar company didn't like that very much. Meanwhile, you have this publicly created right-of-way, the roads, that again were paid for not out of gas taxes, but primarily out of property taxes. And what that meant is that the streetcar company, which had to build its own right-of-way, had to maintain it, had to plow it, had to turn a profit, had to compete against something that was not really a level playing field. And as the Depression ground on and on, ridership really didn't recover very much from the very bottom of 1933, 1934. Revenue stagnated, and here's one thing that you don't always see in some of the histories, and that is the heyday. Everything was going great in 1905, 1910, 1915. There was expansion. You had new cars, and then it went down, and investment stopped. And by 1935, 1939, they've got a bunch of worn-out rolling stock. They've got a bunch of worn-out rails. They have to make a decision. And this is a company that is not getting a public subsidy. There's no federal mass transit administration to help with a grant to buy new streetcars. That didn't come for another 30 years. And so this resource, instead, had to be scrapped. It had to be scrapped because the only way they could continue to do a profit was to buy something that was smaller, and those were diesel buses, and in some cases what are called trolley coaches, which are electric buses. And so in 1939, the streetcars disappeared, and this line, which had been created in 1923, was torn up or paved over. This is a poignant picture for me. This is a series of pictures I took one day about 20 years ago. They were tearing up 8th Street around Terrence or Sarah's Table. And underneath the street, buried for decades, these were the old streetcar rails, neglected, just thrown away. They were scrapped. And I think about the high hopes of the streetcar companies, the unlevel playing field, and it's just, to me, it just was sad. So where are we now? I like to think of a world where streetcars and passenger trains compete with auto and truck and airline traffic on a more level playing field. Amtrak is expected to turn a profit, yet nobody says, what was the profit on I-35 this last year? Nobody ever asked that question. There are places like Freiburg in Germany who show how it can be. Freiburg is not a huge city. The metro area is maybe 200,000. In 1980, I lived in Freiburg for a couple months, and I remember it was a nice city. And then I went back with Barb about 40-some years later, and the city was better than I remembered, and they had expanded the streetcar system, and it was a vibrant city with frequent streetcar traffic. So this is an example of a smaller city that shows it can be done. But that requires real investment, and I don't know if that's going to happen in this country, and I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. What about freight railroads? In one sense, this map from MnDOT from 2022 looks kind of bleak. Look at this. There's only a few railways compared to the peak of 1920. But actually, these railroads, the ones that remain, are really very strong. And most of them are fairly high-speed, well-maintained railroads. And so you still have the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific coming down, now owned by Canadian National, and a number of other routes throughout Minnesota, most of which are in pretty good condition, if not outstanding. Right now, in the western United States, there are 4 main rail systems. There's the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF. There's Canadian National. There's Union Pacific. And there's Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern. Those are the 4 systems. There's been a lot of consolidation. And guess what? All 4 serve the Twin Ports. We have all 4 here, which is pretty unusual. And here is one of those wonderful maps from Twin Porch Trains that shows all the routes that still come in. And interestingly enough, the old Great Northern still comes in, and there's still a lot of traffic to the ore docks and to the grain terminals, and so this is still an important place. And I had mentioned earlier about the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific. This is one of the trains that came off of that and is about to go, will soon go near the Oliver Bridge. How many of you have ridden your bicycles on the Munger Trail after the big climb and noticed a huge bridge over railroad tracks, and you go along them for a while? Canadian National invested tens of millions of dollars to double track that line and to straighten it out. And it probably sees a couple dozen trains a day, and these are not small little trains. So most of the rails are in good shape. Yes, there's some that have been abandoned. Some of those turned into bike trails, the Osage Trail, the Tri-County Trail, the Munger Trail. But the ones that remain are in good shape, and they are working away, doing their job, even if they aren't noticed by many people. And this is my last point, is about passenger trains. Could passenger trains return to Duluth? You'll note on this so-called conceptual enhanced network that was created by the U.S. Department of Transportation, Duluth is part of that. And people have been working to bring back passenger trains to Duluth for a long time, called the Northern Lights Express. And my opinion is it very well might have happened if Representative James Oberstar had won the election in 2010. Why? Because he was a big supporter of rail service, and he was in a position to make it happen. But he was defeated, and the moment passed. I think we will see passenger train service return to Duluth in my lifetime, if I live a reasonable long time. It doesn't have to be high-speed rail. What's needed is reliable, comfortable, reasonably frequent service with times that are reasonably competitive with driving. The tracks are there, and so there aren't technical reasons that would block service. It's really a question of priorities, as these things often are. So, to close, rails made Duluth, rails shaped Duluth, rails still matter to Duluth. And I found it to be a fascinating and rich history, well worth exploring, and I hope that this presentation has maybe made you want to learn a little bit more about the subject too. Thank you.